Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here today with Ian Mann of our Dubai office. And Ian, it's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Tell me, since we've opened our office in Dubai in February of this year, how have things been going?
Well, hello from Dubai, the DFC in the United Arab Emirates. The outlook is absolutely positive here. People are very focused on getting the job done. People feel a huge sense of enthusiasm, and there is also a background um, suite of policies by governments in the Middle East, particularly the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, to co-invest more with China, to be investing in China and to ask for Chinese investment in the region to create what is called a Middle East Chinese corridor. I mean, just starting, if I may, with Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia and China are deeply uh, in investing in their relationship, deepening the investment corridor driven by the alignment of the Saudi Vision 2030, as well as China's Belt and Road Initiative, which you will know far more than me. And as of 2026, over 750 Chinese companies operate in KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Um, the sort of key pillars of Saudi China investment in that sort of Saudi Chinese investment corridor is infrastructure and energy. China's heavily involved in the Jubail industrial city, Jazan city, and there is an enormous 2.6 gigawatt solar power station in Al Shuaibah. Logistics is another one, finance and technology, and there does seem to be a sort of strategic policy shift from Saudi Arabia and China, because Saudi wants to move beyond oil in its economy. It's focusing on localizing manufacturing, green energy, and technology transfer. And what better nation on earth than China to have that relationship with? And I know you've seen it from your side.
That's right. I think from the 15th five-year plan and even before that, we have seen an increased emphasis on the adding of value to manufacturing, particularly high value manufacturing in the green space, in the tech space.
Mhm.
And that's something that has really been a focus over here. And I think that that has meant that there is increased interest from Chinese companies, Chinese investors in exploring the opportunities in the Middle East to enter into those types of cooperation agreements that we've have been so successful in other parts of the world to really double down on those opportunities. Certainly, I was at the OIF conference a few weeks ago, and there was a huge amount of interest in the Middle East and in the opportunities that are there for the expansion of China business going global. And that's been a very key theme, I think, for the Chinese government in terms of the expansion of Chinese interests globally and delivering the exceptional, efficiencies and tech innovations that China has been in the forefront of in manufacturing, delivering that to other parts of the world where there will be benefits both for Chinese enterprise, but also in those countries, creating jobs, creating optionality to those economies.
Yes, Vicky, I couldn't agree more. And, we can see it on the ground. You have Chinese banks who have opened in the UAE and in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. at both a government level, a private level, a state-owned enterprise level, and a sovereign wealth level. All of everyone in the ecosystem is really focused on trying to build the economic and political relationship between the Middle East and China. I mean, I think it's worth noting the very recent trip. From United Arab Emirates' point of view, it's worth mentioning the very recent trip of His Highness Sheikh Khalid bin Hamad bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, where His Highness, went on an official visit to meet the president of China, the chairman of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, and others. And there was a delegation to discuss the relationship, cross-border investments, technology transfer, again with that technology on, that focus on new technologies, clean energy, and also cooperation between. I mean, you'll know better than most. The China Investment Corporation (CIC) actually met with the UAE leadership, which indicates that state Chinese state money and UAE sovereign wealth money is connecting in a way that it hasn't connected before. But this Chinese Middle East relationship, I think, is going to be really interesting for Harneys because I think we are extremely well positioned to provide our legal services to two parties who will be interested in using the neutral jurisdictions of the Cayman Islands, BVI, Jersey, Bermuda, etc., our staple jurisdictions for investing in each other's economies because it gives them a neutral platform with the safety and familiarity of common law. And I know you've been working on a number of cases where the investors have chosen our jurisdictions.
That's right, and I don't think that that neutrality and that certainty can be underestimated, particularly with very high value investments. Parties to those agreements look for jurisdictions which, will not favour one side or the other, which
Mm.
is very much, the familiar territory for offshore, where we see, the repeated use of those jurisdictions for the entities for joint ventures, using them in terms of the list codes if you're going to later on list on any particular exchange. But
Mm.
particularly for the joint ventures, I think that there is a particularly important place, for example, with British Virgin Islands, where we have particular provision within the Business Companies Act to allow directors to vote in favour of their shareholders, as opposed to in the usual course voting in the best interest of all of the shareholders. That's the typical position. But in BVI,
Mm.
you can disapply that and allow nominated directors to vote solely in the interests of their shareholders. That's a very key provision because it prevents all kinds of issues from arising about conflicts of interest, etc. When you have effectively a company law that allows you to behave in the way that one may want to do in those large scale joint ventures. So I think that's important, but not only that, the certainty of whether the transaction documents have a forum clause in favour of one of the offshore courts or an arbitration clause,
Yeah.
which ultimately will be enforced in
Mm.
one of the offshore courts.
Mm. Mm.
The Cayman, BVI, Bermuda, these are familiar places to many of those who are involved in these transactions. They're known for the certainty and neutrality that they provide. that they are will be pro arbitration and creditor friendly courts, and which will, ultimately be interested in ensuring certainty in that business environment. So yes, I do see that that will continue to be opportunity for Harneys, but also, and one would hope, a safe and secure place of incorporation for those transactions to happen with those entities
And
being set up for that purpose.
And I think it's worth saying now that we are talking about the joint venture at its highest ownership level, at a top co, as corporate lawyers we would say. We are not, by suggesting our offshore jurisdictions as neutral platforms for cross-border joint ventures between Middle East and China, we are not suggesting that that excludes the operating companies being, located in any of the financial centers within the Middle East, or for the operating companies at a Chinese level, not to be Chinese companies, because at all of those levels, you are going to need some local companies to raise local finance for local regulatory reasons, and they're absolutely complementary to each other. And I think sometimes people forget that because, both jurisdictions have a fine reputation for their own, incorporated vehicles, and that works really symbiotically with our joint venture vehicles. And equally, Vicky, I'd like to hear your view on this because it's a well-trodden path for Chinese investors to be using offshore vehicles as they've deployed capital around the world. And equally, it's a well-trodden path for Middle East investors to use offshore vehicles as they have deployed capital around the world or bought assets around the world. And I've recently been working for a ultra high net worth family in Saudi Arabia, and they have had BVI companies since, the early 90s, and they're very familiar with the products. It's a generational thing, so there's a certain familiarity in the offshore jurisdictions.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's certainly no different to the position here in Northern Asia. Um,
Mm,
Chinese use of BVI Cayman Islands is second to none, and that's typically been used to ensure, a corporate structure, which, as you rightly point out, is not just simply a BVI or a Cayman Islands or Bermuda entity. There is typically a structure which will include PRC companies, particularly for the operating companies. They're likely to be the entities that will be, you know, undertaking the contracts, employing the employees, doing all of those things. And likewise, when we go abroad for investment here in China,
mm,
we will be looking at um, investments into operating companies, which will typically be, for example, a local operating company with, perhaps a BVI invested in, or a Cayman Islands invested into it. So,
mm.
and again, doesn't necessarily have to be a company, might be a fund, may also be
Yes.
a trust for succession planning. That's been a very popular tool to ensure succession and continuity of the generational wealth here in
Mm,
China as well.
mm,
So
mm.
I don't think it's at all dissimilar, and actually the congruence of those offshore vehicles and the use of them is pretty apparent across Asia, actually.
Yeah, and actually, you raise a very good point, turning more specifically to funds. I mean, we work for a lot of fund managers who are based in Abu Dhabi or DIFC, And they are absolutely setting up regulated local Abu Dhabi or DIFC funds because if they want to raise capital from local people, that's a regulatory requirement. Equally, the sovereign funds in Abu Dhabi are absolutely right to demand that an Abu Dhabi fund is set up for the deployment of sovereign wealth as a matter of sort of national responsibility. But equally, these fund managers have come from, all over the globe, from the States, from the UK, from Switzerland, from Singapore and Hong Kong and Shanghai, and they are all very familiar with Cayman Islands companies. And I was having a conversation with one of our fund manager clients the other day who has set up a Cayman Islands master fund, which has an ADGM feeder into it to satisfy the requirements of an Abu Dhabi investor, whilst also having a fund, a Cayman Islands fund, that's going to be more familiar to Chinese and American investors. So, they can all, there are industry norms for how all of these structures can sort of interlock and work together in a natural ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's right, and actually, that's the wonderful thing about being here in China is that we get to see so many of the different structures and so many of the tactics and strategies that are being deployed to create wealth, to really drive business and power the changes through in the economy. Because new technologies, new opportunities also require new investment to ensure that deployment can happen. And we're quite lucky, really, to be on the forefront of being able to see how that is developing across China and through to the Middle East and beyond. Thinking then of just a little bit about specifically Dubai and its position vis-a-vis Africa. Do you see opportunities there for Chinese investors in Dubai as a hub?
Yes, I mean, we're actually working on a case at the moment where a fund manager in Dubai has been raising capital amongst sort of an international crowd of investors that are living in Dubai for deploying capital in an African startup, a tech startup, and it's just so fascinating because Africa is just so in need of development. It is crying out for, and the World Bank confirms this, it's crying out for more infrastructure spending, and that capital needs to come from overseas. And a wonderful place for that capital to be raised is the UAE, is Dubai, because Dubai is a logistical hub for Africa in terms of transporting commodities, fertilizers, goods, um, you know, a capital raising center. So there's a long history between the UAE and Africa. In the same way, people in the Middle East often just say, well, it's all in the name. We are literally in between the middle of the world. So, we very much welcome Chinese investors, or we equally welcome Chinese companies, VC, companies, startups who are trying to pitch to us, or perhaps companies that are moving on to the next phase and need PE investment or whatever it happens to be. And equally, we're very happy to make introductions for projects in Africa. And I wouldn't either ignore the Indian subcontinent because, for a lot of Indian fund managers and bankers and wealth advisors and ultra high net worths, Dubai is very much a place where they put their children to school and they reside and they get themselves registered as funds and all the rest of it. So, the whole region is crying out for further development, infrastructure, and I think that's where China can play an enormous part. And I was actually in a meeting the other day where the Middle Eastern family, it's a Lebanese family who's lived in the UAE for a long time, and they were talking about their own Jersey trusts, family trusts, and how the conversations amongst high net worth families wherever they are is about the um, upcoming wealth transfer from one generation to the next, which is now said to be the largest generational wealth transfer in human history, and a significant part of that wealth is going to be transferred to women because actually they have become the next generation to be running companies. They have become the CEOs for the family. And that in itself is a fascinating new angle to the products that we provide, not only Jersey, but in all of our jurisdictions that provide trusts, estate planning, and succession planning.
Yes, and I must say that the Jersey angle is particularly relevant. I was only there last week with
Yeah.
our team in Jersey, and fascinating the depth of history that the Channel Islands have in terms of
Mm,
trusts and the expertise that lies within our office there to really be able to offer that as a product to our clients when they're considering how best to deal with that succession issue and to ensure that the many years of hard work that have gone into creating that family wealth are not are put to the best use possible
mm.
with the professional advisors and with those individuals who are now going to be leading the companies and have the stewardship of those companies for future generations to come.
And Vicky, I think there is something deeply cultural in the Middle East where people really, really believe in longevity and heritage. When Harneys first opened in Dubai in February, in the DFC of February this year, people were delighted to hear that we are a 65-year-old firm, that we have been, doing what we are doing for generations. It's our expertise, and it's not just a law firm. It's not just, it then translates to, a recognition of the, true natural justice and fairness of common law courts. It's a recognition actually of that sort of, if things have lasted and stood the test of time, then that's something to believe in. And I think, that's a very sensible sentiment. And I think that's why the offshore jurisdictions, keep thriving because people see that consistency decade after decade.